I would like to welcome everyone to George Johnson's IEP meeting. This is where I would normally introduce everyone in attendance, but because this is a mock IEP and I'm the only person in the room, we will skip that step. I'm Miss Weitzel, George's special education and general education teacher. The purpose of this IEP meeting is to re-examine George's strengths and weaknesses to help us determine the needs that he has and the services that are appropriate for him. I will be discussing the informal assessments, norm referenced assessment, and curriculum-based measurement report that I use to get a better understanding of George's strengths and weaknesses along with his performance on those assessments. Short-term and long-term goals will be discussed later in the meeting, along with some ideas on how the family can help support George's education and success. Before we get started, does anyone have any questions or concerns they would like to address at this time? Great. The first thing I would like to discuss is George's performance on the informal assessments that I administered. I chose checklist, time sampling, and a rating scale. A checklist is in a yes or no format. It's a rubric that I fill out after reading a writing sample from your child. The checklist I completed was chosen to look at George's composition, organization, and paragraph writing skills. This informal assessment showed me that he has a good understanding of how to keep redundancy out of his papers, organize words within a sentence, and split a paragraph into two so that both paragraphs have their own specific focus. George is very good at writing with clarity. The checklist also pointed out some areas that George needs some extra help with. He struggled to write good transitions between paragraphs, identifying extra information that might help the paper, recognizing what removing a word does to the reader's understanding of the topic, and recognizing that each paper has a tone and some words simply do not fit. This is a copy of the checklist I completed on George's writing. As you can see, he did well in several areas, but over half of the items on the checklist were marked as a no, which means that he requires extra instruction and attention in those areas. Based on these results, I have provided George with the opportunity to peer edit other students' papers. This gives him the chance to see the corrections that others have made to his papers, along with making his own corrections on his peers' papers. This helps to create a connection between the rules and actual writing. Do you have any questions or concerns regarding the checklist or the results? Good. The second informal assessment was a rating scale. I chose a rating scale focusing on grammar because it allowed me to narrow down exactly what George's needs were and what he was already good at. This is a copy of the rating scale I used. As you can see, George always used periods and question marks correctly, usually used exclamation marks, apostrophes, parentheses, dashes, and commas correctly, but only sometimes used quotation marks and colons and semicolons correctly. Since the completion of the rating scale, I have provided George with notes and rules on punctuation. He is allowed to use these notes anytime he has a writing assignment. The peer editing mentioned earlier will also help build his grammar skills. Do you have any questions or concerns so far? Good. The last informal assessment was a time sampling. A time sampling is used to take note of a student's behaviors and actions during a set period of time. This was chosen to look at the amount of time George was on task versus off task during the allotted time. This chart shows exactly when George was on task and off task for the first 2 hours of academics. I observed him every 15 minutes for 30 seconds and made a note of what he was doing and whether or not he was on task. The results show that George was only off task 4 out of the 9 observations. This pie chart gives a visual of the percentage of time that George was on task and off task. About 44% of the time, George was off task. However, about 56% of the time, he was on task and participating appropriately. The results show that George has a hard time concentrating on one thing for long periods of time. Since the time sampling was completed, I have incorporated breaks and different activities within the subject area. This seems to be helping as more and more completed work is being turned in. Before moving on, I'd like to hear your input if you have any. The next thing on the agenda to discuss is the norm referenced assessment. I chose the Woodcock-Johnson Test of Achievement to get a full picture of the strengths and weaknesses that George has in math. I chose 3 subtests, the applied problems, calculations, and math fluency. Based on the results from the applied problems assessment, George's grade expectancy in math is at an 11th grade. That's great since it's 1 grade level higher than what he is now. The calculation assessment showed him at a 6.5 grade expectancy, and the math facts fluency put him at a 7.2 grade expectancy. This bar graph shows his grade level now in blue and where he scored on the 3 subtests in orange. All of this means that George has strengths in analyzing a problem and recognizing what mathematical process is needed to solve it. It also shows that George needs extra help in multiplying and dividing with decimals and his automaticity, or how automatic some problems are for him. An example of automaticity is knowing that 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's something that's automatic for us. Now, this may sound like George is below grade average, but these tests mostly cover the basic math facts that George would have learned before he reached the 7th grade. The concepts learned in the math classes between 7th grade and now are only fine-tuning those skills. The standard scores provide us with a better understanding of George's ability level. This bell curve shows the average score being 100 and the standard deviation of 15. This means that 68% of students score between 85 and 115. All of George's scores were within that range. Again, this bell curve shows George's scores with a 101 in applied problems, which is just above average, 91 in math fluency, and 89 in calculation. While the second two scores are low average, they are still within one standard deviation of the average, which is a good thing. Does anyone have any questions regarding the bell curve? Based on the results of this assessment, George does not have any specific learning disability in math. In fact, the skills tested were average, which means that he does not need special education services in mathematics. In addition to his regular math class, I have provided George with flashcards. The more he practices his automaticity, the easier it will be for him to grasp new concepts in his current geometry class. I have also allowed extra time for the completion of assignments when the concept is very difficult. Are there any questions or concerns regarding the results of the assessments and the accommodations being provided? Great. Next, I'd like to discuss the curriculum-based measurement report I administered. I chose to do a written expression to get a better understanding of George's writing skills, including punctuation, grammar, spelling, and capitalization. The test was administered every Tuesday for 6 weeks. A written expression is a short, timed assessment that looks at George's writing mechanics and conventions. I provided George with a short introduction to a story as a starter. George was expected to continue the story, and his writing would be the sample that I used. George has shown some issues with grammar and spelling in the past, and this probe helped me narrow down the specific areas that he struggles with. Each of these tests lasts 4 minutes, 1 minute to plan, and 3 to write. 3 of these tests were administered prior to the 6 weeks to get a baseline, or to see where George started. Throughout the 6 weeks that the written expression was used, I had an intervention in place to help him strengthen his skills. It involved brainstorming ideas, planning and organizing, and writing and revising. George was provided with a list of topics. He chose the topic he was most interested in, and then his first job was to create a list of information related to the topic. He evaluated a plan and organized his ideas, wrote a topic sentence, and supplied supporting sentences. After writing the paper, he reorganized the sentences to create a paper that flows. Finally, he spent time revising his own work or peer-edited with a partner. I chose this intervention so that it could be used in almost all subject areas. After the 4th week, I stopped providing a list to force him to use more brain power to produce the same outcome as when he got to choose the topic. Any questions? The results from the written expression over the 6 weeks shows that George made some great progress. I scored these tests 2 different ways. One was through total words written. The average student in the 10th grade writes 62 to 63 total words during a written expression. George wrote an average of 40 total words for the baseline. By the end of the 6 weeks, I made the goal for George to write 55 total words. George was able to write 49 total words on the last day of testing, which is huge progress compared to where he started with 40. This line graph represents the total words written during each test. It shows where he started on the left, and his progress continues with the blue line on the right. The orange line represents the goal. Though he did not reach the goal of 55 total words, we can clearly see that he was improving and writing more almost every single time. The second way I scored these tests was correct writing sequences. I won't get into all of the specifics on how this is scored because it can be confusing, but if you'd like to meet with me after the meeting to learn how it's scored, I would be more than willing. Basically, correct writing sequences is the number of correct units of writing, which include punctuation, capitalization, spelling, and syntactical and semantic usage. The average 10th grader writes 60 correct writing sequences. George averaged 37 for the baseline. Based on that information, I decided to make 59 correct writing sequences George's goal by the end of the 6 weeks. This bar graph shows George's progress in blue and the goal for each week in orange. On his last written expression, he scored 57 correct writing sequences. That's a huge improvement and right around where we want him to be, with the average student scoring 60. This line graph shows the same information, but we can see a little more clearly how he progressed. Again, his scores are in blue and the goal is in orange. Throughout the 6 weeks, spelling remained a common issue, but his syntax and punctuation usage improved drastically. Based on the scores from the total words written and the correct writing sequences, I decided to continue the use of the intervention, including peer editing, along with regular vocabulary assignments. He would be graded on knowing the definition, along with the spelling of each vocabulary word. I would like to discuss George's strengths next. George has a great understanding of what mathematical processes need to be used for word problems. Most of the time he does well in completing those processes, but many students his age struggle to understand what needs to be done in order to find the answer. With writing, George is great at reducing redundancy, organizing words and sentences within a paper to create flow, and punctuation use. He's aware that when you see the word 2 or 3 times within one paragraph, one of those words needs to be changed. George has told me that he will write a paper and specifically go back to reread it and change any redundant areas. This is also where he would go back and reorganize words within a sentence or sentences within a paragraph to make the paper flow better for the reader. While punctuation started as an issue at the beginning of the 6 weeks of written expression tests, he improved drastically and is now writing with virtually no punctuation errors at all. I will also note that George is a very respectful young man and does not usually engage in problematic behaviors. Are there any strengths you can see that George has at home or outside of school? Now for George's weaknesses. One thing that can impact his learning in all subject areas is his struggle to stay focused on one thing for long periods of time. Another weakness is his automaticity in math. In order for him to be successful in math in the future, his automaticity for the basic math facts need to improve. George struggles with spelling on a regular basis in English and in other subjects. Finally, the amount he can write in a specified amount of time is very low. Does anyone have any additions, comments, or concerns for George's weaknesses? Great. I have created 3 short-term goals for George to reach by the end of the first semester, which is in 3 weeks. 1. By the end of the semester, 3 weeks from now, when given a written expression, George will score 52 total words written. 2. By the end of the semester, 3 weeks from now, when given a written expression, George will score 57 to 60 correct writing sequences with no more than 5 spelling mistakes. 3. By the end of the semester, 3 weeks from now, when given a 1-minute timed basic math worksheet that includes addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication, George will answer 14 questions with 100% accuracy. Does anyone have any additions or changes to make to these goals? Great. I've also created 3 long-term goals for George to meet by the end of the year, which is May 17th. 1. By the end of the school year, when given a written expression, George will score 60 total words written. 2. By the end of the school year, when given a written expression, George will score 60 correct writing sequences with no more than 2 spelling mistakes. 3. By the end of the school year, when given a 1-minute timed basic math worksheet that includes addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication, George will answer 20 questions with 100% accuracy. Are there any additions or changes that need to be made? There are some things that the family can do to help George succeed and reach these goals. I have provided George with basic math flashcards. If you work with him one-on-one with those flashcards, George's automaticity will improve drastically, even if you can only do it once or twice a week. You can also help George succeed with the writing goals by reading through his papers and essays with him. Point out the spelling mistakes and help him sound out the correct spelling. This will help him give ownership when he comes back to school and feels confident that he has made corrections to his paper before his peers even get to read it. Another way you can support George's success is by enforcing a regular bedtime. I understand that George is in the 10th grade and should have more freedom. However, having a regular bedtime for a student his age is critical in his ability to stay focused throughout the day. He has mentioned staying up very late on several occasions, and on those days it is noticeable because he struggles even more than usual to stay focused on the task at hand. We have covered a lot of information today. Are there any questions or concerns? If not, that's the conclusion to this meeting. If any of you have any questions later, you get to thinking about what we talked about and need more clarification, please feel free to reach out. We are all here to help George succeed. I'm Katie Weitzel, and this has been a mock IEP meeting, a requirement for my assessments and lab graduate class. Thank you.